Story 1. The Stranger at the Window. It was a frigid winter night, and I was home alone. Snowflakes clung to the windows, and the wind howled like some unseen predator prowling outside. I had wrapped myself in a blanket and was watching a thriller in our sunroom. The sunroom had become my favorite spot, a cozy, secluded area perfect for movie nights, with its own door leading to the side driveway. The blinds were drawn, shielding me from the dark expanse beyond the glass. Suddenly, the motion-sensing light outside flickered on, casting eerie shadows against the blinds. My heart skipped. I muted the TV, straining to hear any sound. After a minute of silence, I lifted the blinds for a quick look. The driveway was empty. Still uneasy, I slipped on my boots and stepped outside. The crunch of snow beneath my feet was deafening against the silence. I scanned the driveway and surrounding yard. Nothing. Relieved but unsettled, I returned inside, locked the door, and resumed the movie. Not long after, I heard a loud crash outside. It sounded like a bucket toppling over, followed by the motion light activating again. This time, my stomach churned. Something, or someone, was out there. I remained frozen on the couch, my eyes darting to the door, and then I saw it. A silhouette through the blinds. The figure stood perfectly still, arms slightly outstretched, as if reaching for something, or someone. The terror in that moment was paralyzing. When the figure started knocking aggressively on the window, my instincts kicked in. I bolted to the door leading out of the sunroom, but before I could leave, I saw her. An elderly woman with wild, wiry hair stood at the glass door, her eyes wide and filled with something far worse than insanity. She began pounding on the glass with both fists, screaming incomprehensible words. I slammed the door to the sunroom and locked myself in the bathroom, dialing 911 with trembling hands. But my nightmare wasn't over. Minutes later, I heard the unmistakable sound of shattering glass. She had broken into the house. I peeked out cautiously, and there she was, standing in the living room, shards of glass crunching under her feet. Her head turned slowly in my direction, and her lips curled into a deranged smile. I barely managed to lock the bathroom door again before she reached me, banging on it and muttering under her breath. The arrival of the police felt like an eternity later. They subdued her, but the look in her eyes as they dragged her away will haunt me forever. Story 2. The Red Ball. Every winter I escape to my small, isolated house in rural New York for some skiing and solitude. The property is quiet, flanked by a dense forest on one side and a single neighbor's house separated by a fence on the other. The first night of my visit was uneventful, the kind of peaceful evening I had grown to cherish. But the next morning, as I stepped outside to warm up the car, I noticed something strange. A large, bright red ball sitting on the snow-covered lawn. It hadn't been there the night before. Assuming it belonged to the neighbor's kids, I tossed it back over the fence and thought nothing of it. That evening, after returning from a day of skiing, I found the same red ball in the exact spot on my lawn. The sheer eeriness of it sent a shiver down my spine. This time I picked it up, brought it inside, and left it in the living room. That night I woke to the sound of faint laughter. Childlike, but warped, an unsettling giggle that carried on the cold wind. I checked the window and froze. The red ball was back on the lawn. I searched my house, but the ball I had brought inside was nowhere to be found. Panic set in. I locked every door and window, but sleep evaded me. The following morning I confronted my neighbor. He was an elderly man who lived alone. When I mentioned the laughter and the ball, he gave me a puzzled look and said no children lived in the area. That night, the laughter returned. This time, it was louder and accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps crunching in the snow. I crept to the window and pulled the curtain aside. Standing near the edge of the lawn was a child, barely visible in the pale moonlight. They were motionless, facing my house. I ducked down and closed the blinds, heart pounding in my chest. Moments later, I heard a soft knock at the front door. The knock turned into banging, and then it stopped. Summoning all my courage, I peeked out again. The child was gone, but the red ball was back. This time, it was directly in front of my door. I left the house the next morning and haven't returned since. Whatever wanted to play with me, it wasn't human. Story 3. The Neighbor Next Door. When George and I first saw the house next door, we thought we had hit the jackpot, a quiet, friendly neighborhood. But everything changed when the new neighbor moved in. We never saw him unpack or introduce himself. On the third day, George and I decided to break the ice and knocked on his door. Nobody answered, but as we walked away, George nudged me. Through the blinds by the window, we saw him staring at us, his eyes piercing, his face emotionless. That night, strange noises began. A low, metallic scraping sound echoed from his backyard. From my upstairs window, I saw him under the faint glow of a single floodlight, dragging a large piece of wood and hacking at it with a saw. The next night, it escalated. The sounds of muffled screaming woke us both. I looked out and saw him dragging something heavy into his house, but what chilled me was his sudden glance up at my window. We called the police, but by the time they arrived, the house was dark and quiet. The officers dismissed it as a misunderstanding, but George and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. A few nights later, we woke to the sound of glass shattering downstairs. Adrenaline coursed through me as I grabbed a baseball bat and crept down the hall. In the shadows of the living room, he stood, a hulking figure with a blood-stained hoodie. His face was a twisted mask of rage and something far worse. He charged, and I barely managed to shut the door in time. We barricaded ourselves in George's room and called the police again, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. What they found in his house turned our blood cold. Blood-soaked tarps, dismembered mannequins, and a journal filled with disturbing ramblings about neighbors who watch. To this day, I can't sleep without locking every door and window twice. Because sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see his face staring through the blinds,